If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Joseph McAllister, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in December 1963. I still get chills thinking about those dark days in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. Some nights, when the wind howls just right and the moon is full, I can still hear its whispers. I was 42 then, working as a forest ranger after serving as a Marine Scout sniper in Korea. Life was different back then. I'd lost Sarah, my wife, to cancer just 2 years before, and the quiet of the wilderness became my escape. The vast pine forests and frozen lakes helped heal something broken inside me. Well, at least I thought they did. You see, I'd always felt at home in these woods. My Native American grandmother used to tell me stories when I was little, tales about spirits and creatures that roamed these ancient forests. Back then, they were just stories that gave me goosebumps. Now I know better. It all started when 3 hunters went missing in a single week. Strange enough on its own, but what made it worse was the weather. We were hitting record lows, negative 42.4 F some nights, with snow piled 6 feet high in places. But these weren't normal winter conditions. The animals knew it too. They were acting weird, moving in ways I'd never seen before. And the lights? The northern lights were showing up at all the wrong times, dancing across the sky like warning signals. I remember checking my lucky compass that first morning, the one my war buddy gave me before he died in Korea. It always kept me on track, never failed me once. Until that week. Looking back, maybe I should have taken that as a sign of what was coming. I was the best tracker in the area, you see. I could read the wilderness like most folks read their morning paper. But nothing in my training, not the Marines, not my years as a ranger, not even my grandmother's stories, could have prepared me for what I was about to face in those frozen woods. That first day of the search started normally enough. The morning was bitter cold, and my breath made thick clouds in front of my face as I checked my gear. I had my rifle, emergency supplies, and enough food for 3 days. Something in my gut told me to pack extra matches and flares, a habit that would later save my life. The first strange thing I noticed was the silence. Anyone who spent time in winter woods knows they're never really quiet. There's always something moving, birds calling, branches creaking. But that morning, nothing. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. Around noon, I found the hunters' camp. The sight made my skin crawl. Their tent was still standing, untouched by the recent snowfall. A pot of coffee sat on the dead campfire, frozen solid. 3 sets of footprints led away from the camp in different directions, like they'd just gotten up and walked away in the middle of their morning coffee. But what really got to me were the trees. Someone, or something, had carved weird symbols into the bark. They weren't anything I recognized, and I'd learned all the local tribal markings from my grandmother. These were different, wrong somehow. As I studied the campsite, the temperature started dropping fast, too fast. Within minutes, my thermometer showed a 30-degree drop. That's when I found the first dead animal, a deer, but something was off about it. Its chest was torn open, but there was no blood, no mess, just empty. Like something had carefully removed its insides. I radioed back to base, and they sent 2 more rangers, Frank Reeves and Mike Peterson, along with Tommy Two Bears, a local tribal guide I'd known for years. They were supposed to meet me by nightfall. That evening, as the sun set, I heard something that still haunts me today, children laughing. Clear as day, coming from somewhere in the swirling snow. But there hadn't been children in these woods for miles. I knew then that whatever we were dealing with wasn't normal, not normal at all. I set up camp that night, but sleep wouldn't come. My compass, my lucky compass that had never failed me, started spinning wildly for no reason. And outside my tent, something moved through the darkness, something big. The worst part? Those children's voices kept calling, getting closer and closer, But now they were calling my name, using Sarah's voice, my dead wife's voice. The next morning, I met up with Frank, Mike, and Tommy at our planned spot. None of us had slept well. Mike kept jumping at every sound, and Frank looked worried, something I'd never seen before in my tough old friend. "Joe, something's not right here," Tommy said quietly while we ate breakfast. "The spirits are restless. My grandfather used to warn us about times like this." He pulled out a small bundle of sage from his pocket and lit it, letting the smoke drift around us. I remembered my grandmother doing the same thing when I was young. We split into two teams, Frank with Mike and me with Tommy. We hadn't gone more than a mile when we found the first body. I wish I could forget what we saw. It was one of the hunters, frozen solid, but something was wrong. There was no ice on him, and his face. His face was twisted in pure terror, like he'd seen something so horrible, it killed him right there. On his chest were strange marks, like someone had drawn patterns with their fingers. That's when our radios started acting up. First came the static, then weird sounds, voices from what seemed like old radio shows from the 1920s. Frank's voice cut through suddenly. "Joe, we've got tracks here, but they're huge." Tommy and I rushed to their location. What we found made no sense. The tracks were massive, 15 feet between steps, and deep in the snow. They weren't animal tracks, but they weren't human either. Whatever made them walked on two legs. Then we heard the trees starting to snap, one by one, like matchsticks breaking. But there was no wind, not even a breeze, just crack, crack, crack. The smell hit us next, like rotten meat and decay. Mike started shaking. "We need to get out of here," he kept saying. "We need to get out now." That's when we saw it, just for a second, through the trees. It was tall, so tall it seemed to touch the branches above. It had a crown of antlers, but they weren't like any deer antlers I'd ever seen. They were twisted, wrong. Its body was thin, impossibly thin, and its skin looked like old, gray tree bark. But its eyes, God, its eyes were glowing blue, like frozen fire, and when it moved like nothing that should exist in our world. Then it spoke. It used Sarah's voice again, calling my name. Then it used the voices of the missing hunters, calling for help. Tommy grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Wendigo," he whispered, "the winter spirit that devours. My people have feared it for generations." We needed to run. But where do you run when the monster hunting you knows these woods better than you do? Everything went bad really fast after that. The snow started falling harder, but only around us, like we were trapped in our own personal blizzard. Mike couldn't take it. He started screaming about seeing faces in the snow, about hearing voices calling him. Before any of us could stop him, he pulled out his gun and, well, we lost him. Frank tried to be brave. He was always the tough one, always looking out for others. When we heard screaming in the distance, he ran to help, thinking it might be the other hunters. Tommy and I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. That was the last time we saw him alive. We found his body an hour later. I won't describe what was left of him. I just remember Tommy saying prayers in his native language while I threw up in the snow. "Listen to me, Joe," Tommy said after we buried Frank. This Wendigo, it's not just a monster. It's an ancient evil. It doesn't just want to kill us. It wants to make us suffer, make us hungry, make us like it." The temperature kept dropping. Our watches all stopped at 3:33 a.m., though it was middle of the day. The northern lights appeared again, but wrong, showing faces in them, faces of people I knew were dead. Tommy kept burning his sage, drawing symbols in the snow with blessed ash. He taught me quick, showed me what his people had used to fight these things for hundreds of years. But I could see in his eyes that he knew what was coming. "One of us has to make it," he told me. "One of us has to stop it." He handed me his medicine bag, full of sacred herbs and blessed items. "Your grandmother's blood runs in your veins, Joe. You'll know what to do when the time comes." That night, Tommy went out alone. He said he was going to perform an ancient ritual to weaken the Wendigo. I tried to stop him, but he just smiled and said, "Some battles can't be won by running away." I heard his chanting for hours, echoing through the trees. Then came the screams, both his and something else's. Something angry, something ancient. And I knew I was alone now. Alone with a monster that had already killed my friends and was now coming for me. I knew I had to end this one way or another. Tommy's sacrifice had given me a chance, and I could feel the Wendigo was weaker now. Following my grandmother's old teachings and what Tommy had told me, I headed to the one place that might give me a fighting chance, an ancient tribal burial ground marked by standing stones. My lucky compass was spinning like crazy, but somehow I knew where to go. The air got colder with each step, and ice formed on my beard. The northern lights above showed faces of everyone I'd lost: Sarah, Frank, Mike, Tommy, all watching. I reached the burial ground just as the moon rose. There was a frozen waterfall on one side and a cave entrance on the other. The standing stones made a perfect circle, covered in ice and ancient carvings. This was it. This was where it would end. It didn't keep me waiting long. The Wendigo came, walking through the trees like a shadow. Up close, it was even worse than before. Its skin was like old bark, stretched over bones that were too long, too thin. Those blue eyes burned with hunger, a hunger that could never be satisfied. It spoke again, using all the voices it had collected. Sarah's voice begging me to join her. Tommy's voice screaming in pain. The lost hunters calling for help. But this time, I was ready. I threw down the blessed herbs in a circle, just like Tommy had shown me. The Wendigo screamed, a sound no human throat could make. It charged at me, but couldn't cross the circle. We fought there, in that ancient place. Me with my grandmother's teachings and Tommy's sacred items, it with its centuries of evil power. The fight was brutal. The thing was fast, faster than anything should be. Its claws caught me more than once. The cold was worse than any winter I'd ever felt. But I remembered what Tommy said about some battles being worth dying for. I pulled out my lucky compass, the one my war buddy had died protecting. In the moonlight, I saw what I'd never noticed before: ancient symbols carved into its back, similar to the ones Tommy had drawn. My grandmother must have known, must have planned for this day. The Wendigo lunged one last time, and I drove the compass deep into its chest, right into where a heart should be. The thing screamed, and the world went white with cold and pain. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. The doctors said they found me half frozen in the snow. They couldn't explain why my left eye was completely white from frostbite, or why 3 of my fingers had turned black and needed to be removed. The strangest thing? All my dark hair had turned snow white overnight. The official report said we were caught in a freak storm. They found the bodies of the hunters, Frank and Mike. Tommy's body was never found. The higher-ups buried my real report. Who'd believe a story about an ancient winter spirit anyway? But I know what happened out there. The proof is all around me, even today. Those strange symbols are still carved in the trees, visible even in summer. The compass, my lucky compass, never pointed north again after that night. Sometimes it spins by itself, like it's warning me of something. The changes in me went deeper than just my appearance. I can't feel hot or cold anymore, like that night froze something inside me forever. Meat makes me sick now. I can't even stand the smell of it. Every full moon, I stay awake all night, listening. And sometimes, when storms are coming, I know hours before they hit, like something in my bones can sense them. They declared that area of the forest a hazard zone, closed it off to the public. The local tribes nodded knowingly but said nothing. They just started leaving small bundles of sage near my cabin every month. You might ask if I killed it, the Wendigo. I wish I could say yes, but deep down, I know the truth. You can't kill something that's existed since the first winter. The best you can do is weaken it, make it sleep for a while. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the northern lights dance in the sky, I hear children laughing in the distance, and every now and then I catch a glimpse of blue eyes watching me from the trees. That's when I know It's still out there, waiting, growing stronger, getting hungry again. And the worst part? Sometimes in my dreams, I can feel that same hunger growing inside me too. My name is Marcus Whitaker, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me back in 1975. I know some of you might not believe my story, but every word of it is true. I still have nightmares about those dark days in Shadow Creek, and my missing leg serves as a daily reminder that some things in this world can't be explained. Before all this happened, I was just a regular forest ranger in Shoshone National Forest, Wyoming. It's the place where I grew up, where my father and grandfather served as rangers before me. After coming back from Vietnam, where I worked as a combat medic, I thought nothing could scare me anymore. Boy, was I wrong. I guess I should mention that I had a special connection to these woods, but not always for good reasons. Back in '68, I lost my brother Tom to what they called an animal attack. I never believed that story. The way they found him was different. That's partly why I became a ranger, following my family's footsteps, but also hoping to understand what really happened to Tom. I was known around here as the wolf guy. Funny how life works, I spent years helping injured wolves, understanding their behavior, and earning their trust. I always carried my grandfather's silver knife with me, more as a good luck charm than anything else. Never thought it would end up saving my life. October 1975 started strangely. The days were darker than usual, and something felt off in the forest. The old pines, some over 300 years old, seemed to whisper warnings. At night, this weird red light danced in the sky, like some kind of twisted aurora. And the moon, well, that was the strangest part. It stayed in the same phase for weeks, like it was stuck or something. I remember sitting in my cabin, looking at reports of cattle mutilations from nearby ranches. The way these animals were cut up, it was too clean, too precise. No normal predator could do that. But that was just the beginning. What came next would change my life forever, and make me question everything I thought I knew about nature, about reality itself. Let me tell you what really happened in those woods. But I warn you, this isn't a campfire story. This is about something that's still out there, something that still hunts in the shadows of Shadow Creek. It all started with the wolf prints. Not regular wolf prints, these were huge, bigger than anything I'd ever seen in my 15 years as a ranger. At first I thought maybe we had an unusually large wolf passing through, but deep down something felt wrong about them. The local ranchers kept calling about their animals. They'd find their cows and sheep cut up in ways that didn't make sense. No blood around the bodies, cut so clean they looked surgical. When I went to check these sites, our local wolves would stay far away, tails between their legs. I'd never seen them act so scared before. Then the calls about the howls started coming in. Now, I know what wolf howls sound like. I've heard them 1,000 times. But these were different. They sounded almost human, like someone trying to copy a wolf but not quite getting it right. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. On my third day investigating, I met with some folks from the Native American reservation nearby. I'll never forget what the elder told me. He said, "The shadows are walking, Ranger Whitaker. Keep your silver close." When I asked him to explain, he just shook his head and left. Later that day, I heard some kids in town talking about seeing men with wolf heads near their school bus stop. I decided to check out the old ranger station in the north section. It hadn't been used in years. As I drove up there, my radio started acting weird. Instead of the usual static, I heard what sounded like deep growling coming through the speaker. I switched it off, but I could still hear something. When I got to the station, things got worse. The metal door was bent outward, like something very strong had pushed its way out. Inside, I found blood trails that just disappeared halfway across the floor. No drag marks, no footprints, nothing. Just blood that stopped in the middle of the room. But what really got to me were the claw marks on the walls. Not down low, where a bear might scratch, these were 8 feet up, deep gouges in the solid wood. Something had stood on two legs to make those marks. As I was taking photos of the damage, I heard branches breaking in the forest behind me. It was getting dark, earlier than it should have. That's when I saw them, amber eyes reflecting in the tree line. Not just one pair, but many, all at different heights, all watching me. I backed up to my truck slowly, keeping my hand on my grandfather's silver knife. The eyes followed my every move. Just as I reached for the door handle, a howl broke the silence. But this one came from behind me. They had somehow circled around without me noticing. I knew right then that I needed help. This was bigger than anything I'd dealt with before. What I didn't know was that calling for help would lead to even more deaths, and turn this investigation into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The next morning, I made some calls and put together a small team. Rick Martinez, a wildlife biologist who I'd worked with before, arrived first. Then came Sarah Winters, who studied unknown animals. She called herself a cryptozoologist. John Running Bear, an elder from the local tribe, also joined us, though he seemed worried about being there. I showed them everything I'd found, the weird prints, the photos of the claw marks, and the dead animals. Sarah got really excited about the prints because they seemed to change from wolf paws to something like human footprints with claws. Rick thought it was some kind of hoax at first, but that changed after our first night together in the woods. We were setting up cameras near one of the caves when we heard it. Heavy breathing and the sound of something big walking on two legs. The bushes moved, and we saw a shadow that looked like a man, but much taller. When Rick shined his flashlight at it, we all froze. This thing was about 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with a wolf's head but standing like a person. Its eyes glowed amber in the light, and then it smiled at us. Actually smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. Before any of us could move, it disappeared into the darkness. Rick dropped his flashlight, his hands shaking. "That's not possible," he kept saying. But we all saw it. The next day, Rick went to collect some fur samples he'd found. We told him not to go alone, but he insisted. That was the last time we saw him alive. We found his body that evening, laid out like someone was studying it. Like he was the specimen, not the scientist. Sarah started recording everything with her equipment. She said she could hear voices in the static, not just growls, but words we couldn't quite understand. She became obsessed with the caves, saying the answers were underground. One morning, she went in early to set up some recording devices. All we ever found was her backpack, with the recorder still running. The tape was full of screams and something that sounded like laughter, but not human laughter. John Running Bear knew more than he was telling us. One night, he finally opened up. "These aren't just animals," he said. "They're the ones who walk between. They can be wolf, they can be man, and sometimes they're both. Your bullets won't stop them." He showed me some old cave paintings that looked exactly like what we'd seen. Tall wolfmen walking on two legs. That's when things got even stranger. Our radios stopped working completely. The sky stayed dark even during the day. And the local wolves, the normal ones I'd known for years, started acting weird. They'd follow me around, but not in a threatening way. More like they were trying to protect me. We found more dens, each one worse than the last. They had things in them that showed these creatures were smart. They used tools. They kept trophies. And worst of all, they seemed to be planning something. We found maps of the area with marks on them, marks that matched where people had gone missing over the years. John said we needed to check the deepest cave system, where the old tribal burial grounds were. He believed that's where we'd find answers. But as we prepared to go underground, we all knew something was watching us, something that knew we were coming. I remember looking at my grandfather's silver knife and thinking about what John had said about regular bullets not working. I had no idea just how important that knife would become, or how many of us wouldn't make it back out of those caves alive. The cave system was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The deeper we went, the colder it got. Our flashlights seemed weaker than they should be, barely cutting through the darkness. John led the way, following markings on the walls that he said told an ancient story about these creatures. We found a huge underground chamber with an old stone bridge crossing over a dark river. The walls were covered with paintings showing wolfmen and humans. Some of the paintings showed people changing into these creatures. John translated the symbols, saying they told of a pack that had existed for hundreds of years, taking people to grow their numbers. That's when everything went wrong. First, we heard the splashing in the river below. Then came the growls. Not from one direction, but from everywhere. Our flashlights started flickering, and in those flashes, we saw them. 7-foot-tall creatures, moving on 2 legs and 4, surrounding us on both sides of the bridge. Their eyes glowed like burning amber in the dark. But the scariest part? The largest one, their leader, stepped forward and spoke, not in growls, but in words in my head. It knew my name. It knew about my brother Tom. He joined us, it said in my mind, and now it's your turn. John pushed me back and pulled out some kind of tribal charm. "Run," he shouted. "Get to the higher ground." Those were his last words. The pack attacked, but he fought bravely, giving me time to get across the bridge. I heard his final scream echo through the caves. I ran through tunnels, trying to remember the way out. The creatures followed, but they weren't just chasing me, they were hurting me, driving me deeper into their territory. I ended up in what looked like their den. The floor was covered with bones, and the walls had scratch marks everywhere. The pack leader, the Alpha, cornered me there. In the dim light, I could see it was different from the others. Its eyes showed intelligence, almost human-like. Through that weird mental connection, it told me they were growing stronger, taking more territory, and needed new blood in their pack. I noticed something else too. Some of the pack seemed afraid of my grandfather's silver knife. They stayed back when I pointed it at them. The Alpha saw this and snarled, ordering the others to attack. Everything became chaos. I slashed with the knife, and wherever it cut, the creatures howled in real pain. Then I heard it, the sound of rushing water. The old dam upstream must have broken, and the cave system was flooding. The pack scattered in panic. As the water rushed in, the Alpha lunged at me. We fought in the rising water, and that's when it happened. I plunged the silver knife deep into its chest. The creature's howl shook the whole cave. The ceiling started collapsing. I tried to run, but one of the falling rocks crushed my left leg. The last thing I remember was being pulled through the water by something furry. But whether it was one of them or a regular wolf, I still don't know. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. The doctors had to amputate my left leg below the knee. It was too badly crushed to save. But that wasn't the strangest part of my recovery. Things had changed in me, changes I still can't fully explain. I could suddenly sense things I never could before. I knew when the moon would be full without checking any calendar. Regular wolves started treating me differently, not like a human anymore, but not quite like one of them either. They'd follow me around town, keeping watch, like they were protecting me. The official report said there was a cave-in caused by flooding, and 3 unidentified bodies were found. They couldn't explain what kind of animals they were. The lab tests just came back as inconclusive. The authorities dynamited the cave entrance shut, and the whole area was declared restricted. But it wasn't over. Every full moon, I get this restless feeling. I can't sleep, and sometimes I hear howls in the distance that make my blood run cold. I know it's them, the ones that got away. The Alpha survived, I'm sure of it. Sometimes I dream about running with the pack. And when I wake up, my leg, the one that's not there anymore, tingles like it's trying to tell me something. The strangest thing is the meat cravings. I used to be fine with a normal diet, but now, let's just say my steaks have to be pretty rare. Every month, around the full moon, local ranchers still report missing livestock. They blame regular wolves, but I know better. I can feel when they're near. The dogmen, I mean. It's like a pressure in my head. A warning signal that something's not right. The local wolves have become like family to me now. They warn me when the others are close. Last winter, A pack of regular wolves actually chased off what I'm sure was one of the dogmen trying to get close to my cabin. It's like they've chosen sides in some ancient war I still don't fully understand. I tried telling this story to others over the years, but most people just think I'm crazy. The ones who were there, Rick, Sarah, John, they can't back me up because they're gone. Sometimes I visit their graves and wonder if I could have done more to save them. I still carry my grandfather's silver knife. It's the only thing I know for sure that can hurt them. The knife has these strange markings on it now, markings that weren't there before that night in the cave. John would probably know what they mean, but I guess some secrets will stay buried with him. Today, I'm retired from the Ranger Service. My prosthetic leg works fine, but the real reason I quit was that I couldn't trust myself in the woods anymore. Sometimes I feel more wolf than human, especially during the full moon. I still live in Wyoming, but far from Shadow Creek. Though if you ask me, no distance is really far enough. The dogmen are still out there, growing their pack, hunting in the shadows. Every now and then, I hear stories about missing hikers or strange sightings in the national forest. I keep a file of newspaper clippings marking their movements on a map. The pattern is growing, spreading like a slow poison across our wilderness. So that's my story. Believe it or not, it's all true. And if you're ever hiking in the mountains and hear something that sounds like a wolf's howl but not quite right, or if you see eyes glowing in the darkness that seem a bit too high off the ground, don't try to be brave. Just run. Run as fast as you can, and pray they haven't already caught your scent. Because once they have, they never really let you go. I should know. Even now, 10 years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I can hear them calling me. And the scariest part? Sometimes I want to answer back. My name is Theodore Harrison, but everyone calls me Ted. What I'm about to tell you happened to me back in 1981, when I was working as a ranger at Mount Baker Wilderness in Washington State. I was 47 then, and I thought I'd seen everything in my 20 years as a smoke jumper and forest ranger. But I was wrong, so terribly wrong. Before I start, you should know a bit about me. I used to be a different person, had a PhD in forestry, and was headed for a cushy university job. But life had other plans. After losing my entire team in a devastating forest fire in '79, I hit the bottle hard. It took me years to get sober, and by the time this story takes place, I had been clean for 5 years. The guilt, though, that never really left me, especially about that climber I had to leave behind years ago. His face still haunts my dreams. That August was unlike anything we'd seen before. The drought had turned the usually lush wilderness into a tinderbox. I was stationed at one of our highest posts, over 8,000 feet up, surrounded by ancient volcanic rocks and twisted trees. My job was simple: patrol the area, help lost hikers, and report anything unusual. And boy, was I about to find something unusual. It started with small things at first. Hikers reporting trees that seemed to move when they weren't looking. Dead patches of forest where everything was just wrong. But what really got my attention were the missing persons reports. Not just recent ones, these cases went back 50 years. All in the same area, all without any explanation. I remember sitting in my cabin that first night, looking through my wildlife photos. Photography was my hobby, helped keep my mind off drinking. Something in the background of one picture caught my eye. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just shadows playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right in these woods. Little did I know, I was about to face something that would change not just my life, but my understanding of reality itself. Something that had been waiting in these ancient forests, harvesting souls for longer than anyone could imagine. And it had noticed me too. It all started getting really strange on a Monday morning. I was doing my usual patrol when I found something that made my skin crawl. 3 hikers' backpacks, perfectly arranged in a triangle, sitting in a clearing. But the weird part? The grass around them was dead in a perfect circle, like something had sucked the life right out of it. I called it in, of course. But when our search team arrived, we found something even worse. The trees around that area were covered in this weird amber-colored sap I'd never seen before. It wasn't maple syrup or pine resin. This stuff seemed to move on its own, like it was alive somehow. When I tried to take a sample in a jar, it actually felt warm. That's not normal. Not at all. Over the next few days, things got worse. I started finding plants growing in ways that just didn't make sense. Ferns spiraling in perfect geometric patterns, flowers blooming in the middle of dead zones, and trees that seemed to bend away from their natural direction, all pointing toward Devil's Peak. But what really shook me was what I found on day 3. I was checking my wildlife cameras. I had set up several to track bear movements, and what I saw in those photos, well, I still have trouble talking about it. One sequence showed a perfectly normal forest at 3 a.m. The next shot, taken just 10 seconds later, showed all the trees leaning in one direction, like they were reaching for something. The third photo was completely black, and the camera was found crushed the next day. That evening, I got a call about 4 missing researchers. They were supposed to be studying the drought's effects on the forest. Dr. Lisa Winters, their team leader, had radioed in about finding some unusual fungal growth. And then, nothing. Complete silence. I sat in my cabin that night, looking at my maps and notes. The missing people, the dead plants, the moving trees, it all formed a pattern, centered around Devil's Peak. As I was marking the locations, my radio crackled to life. Through the static, I heard something that wasn't quite a voice, and wasn't quite the wind. It sounded like leaves rustling, but somehow forming words. We grow. I switched the radio off immediately, my hands shaking. Outside my window, I swear I saw the shadows of the trees moving, even though there wasn't any wind that night. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, I heard the sound of wood cracking, like something massive was walking through my forest. I knew right then, whatever was happening, it wasn't just some environmental problem. Something was out there, something that had been waiting for a very long time. And somehow, I had a terrible feeling it knew I was watching. The next morning, I set out to find the missing research team. The forest felt different now, quieter, like everything was holding its breath. I brought along Kevin O'Brien, one of our best search and rescue guys, and Maria Rodriguez, another researcher who knew the missing team well. We found Dr. Winter's last campsite around noon. What we saw there still gives me nightmares. Their tents were exactly as they'd left them, sleeping bags unzipped, coffee cups half full, research papers scattered around. But the strangest thing was the plants. All around their camp, mushrooms had grown overnight, glowing with a faint blue light. Maria said she'd never seen anything like them before. "Look at this," Kevin called out, holding up Dr. Winter's journal. The last entry read, "They're not just moving, they're watching. The trees are watching us. The fungus, it's all connected. I can hear them talking through it. They want us to—" The writing stopped mid-sentence. That's when we heard it, a sound like wood creaking, but with a rhythm like footsteps. Maria pointed to something behind me, her face white as a sheet. I turned slowly, and there, between 2 ancient pines, I saw it for the first time. It looked almost human, but it was huge, at least 12 feet tall. Its body was made of twisted branches and vines, and where its face should have been, there were knots in the wood that looked eerily like human faces. As we watched, frozen in fear, it moved like flowing sap, smooth but unnatural. Kevin was the first to break. He ran. We all ran. But the forest, it had other plans. Vines shot out from nowhere, wrapping around Kevin's legs. Before I could reach him, plants burst from the ground, growing impossibly fast, covering him completely. Maria screamed. I grabbed Maria's hand and pulled her along, running blindly through the trees. Behind us, that thing was following, not rushing, just moving steadily, like it knew we couldn't escape. We made it to a clearing when Maria suddenly stopped. Her eyes were strange, unfocused. "Don't you hear it, Ted?" she whispered. "It's beautiful. They're all singing." Before I could stop her, she turned and walked toward the creature. I tried to grab her, but she pushed me away. "They've been waiting so long," she said, smiling. "They just want to make us part of everything." I watched, helpless, as she walked into the thing's embrace. The branches wrapped around her like a gentle hug, and then she was gone, absorbed into its wooden body. I could see her face for a moment, peaceful, like she was sleeping, before it merged completely with the bark. I ran. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. Behind me, I heard that awful sound again. Trees moving, branches reaching, and underneath it all, a deep, ancient hunger that had finally awakened. When I made it back to my cabin, I locked the door and tried to radio for help. But all I got was that strange rustling sound again. And this time, I could almost understand the words, "You'll join us too, Theodore Harrison. We're just getting started." I spent that night in my cabin, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Every creak of the wood made me jump. Around midnight, a strange mist started seeping under my door. It was green and glowing, filled with tiny spores that floated like dust. I covered my face with a wet cloth, remembering my old firefighting training. That's when I heard Dr. Winter's voice outside my window. "Ted, please help me. I'm still here." I knew it couldn't really be her, but her voice sounded so real, so scared. When I peeked through the blinds, I saw her face, not on a body, but formed in the bark of a tree, like a living carving. Her eyes moved, looking right at me. "It showed me everything, Ted," she whispered. "It's been here since before humans. It's not evil. It just wants to grow, to change us, to make us perfect." More faces appeared in the trees. Kevin, Maria, and others I didn't recognize. Must be the hikers who went missing over the years. They all started whispering at once, telling me to come outside, to join them. I had to know what this thing was. I grabbed my camera, my flashlight, and, breaking 5 years of sobriety, took a long drink from my emergency whiskey. Then I stepped outside. The thing was waiting for me in the clearing. In the moonlight, I could see it better now. It wasn't just one creature. It was like many bodies merged together, all made of leaves, branches, and fungi. As it moved, I saw faces appear and disappear in its bark-like skin. "What are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. It didn't speak with words. Instead, images filled my head. Ancient forests, deeper and darker than anything we have today. Strange spores falling from the stars. The earth changing, growing, absorbing everything in its path. This thing, this harvester, had been waiting underground for thousands of years, spreading its fungus network, connecting all the trees, waiting for the right time to emerge. "Why now?" I managed to ask. More images flooded my mind. Drought weakening the forest's natural defenses, pollution changing the soil, humans cutting down the old trees that had kept it trapped. We had freed it without even knowing. It reached for me with a branch-like arm. Where it touched the ground, mushrooms sprouted instantly, glowing blue and purple. The air filled with spores, and I started feeling dizzy. Everything looked dreamlike, and the trees seemed to be dancing. "Join us," the voices said together. "Be part of something greater." But I remembered the fire of '79, remembered the climber I'd left behind. I'd failed them. I wasn't going to fail again. I had to stop this thing no matter what. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The entity followed, patient and inevitable, as more faces emerged from its wooden body, all calling my name. I knew I had to find a way to fight it. But how do you fight something that controls the entire forest? Then I remembered something from my firefighting days, something about an old native burial ground near Devil's Peak. Maybe there was a reason they buried their dead there. Maybe they knew something we'd forgotten. I turned and ran toward the peak, the harvester following behind me like a rolling wave of living wood and glowing fungi. The real fight was about to begin, and I had no idea if I would survive it. I ran up Devil's Peak, my lungs burning. The moon was full, lighting my way as I climbed higher and higher. Behind me, the harvester was moving through the trees like a living wave. The faces in its bark were screaming now, not in pain, but in excitement. When I reached the old burial ground, I finally understood. The ground here was different. No plants grew on the ancient graves, and the air felt warmer. The old stories said this place was protected by fire spirits. I'd always thought that was just a legend, but now. I pulled out my emergency flares, my hands shaking. The harvester was getting closer, spreading out like a wall of twisted trees and glowing mushrooms. The spores in the air were getting thicker, making everything look hazy and strange. You cannot stop what must be, it spoke in my head, using the voices of everyone it had taken. We are the future. We are what the forest wants to become. That's when I noticed something. Where the warm air rose from the burial ground, the spores couldn't float. They burned up, like dust in a flame. I had an idea, but it was risky. Really risky. I took out my lighter, the one I'd kept from my drinking days to remind me of my struggles. "You want me?" I shouted. "Come and get me!" It rushed forward, branches reaching for me like hundreds of hands. At the last second, I lit the flares and threw them into the cracks in the ground where the warm air was coming from. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground started to shake. Fire burst from the earth like geysers, ancient flames that had been trapped underground for centuries. The harvester screamed, not with one voice, but with hundreds. Its wooden body started to burn, and I could see all the faces in its bark crying out as the flames spread. But I hadn't won yet. A burning branch caught my jacket, and suddenly I felt Harvester trying to pull me in. Its thoughts flooded my mind. Memories of ancient forests, of stars falling to earth, of endless patient waiting. I could feel myself starting to give in. "Join us," it whispered. "Feel what we feel. Live forever in the forest." Then I remembered something, the face of that climber I'd left behind years ago. I'd promised myself never to fail anyone again. With all my strength, I pulled away, falling backward into one of the fire geysers. I expected to burn, but the flames felt cool, like they knew I was trying to help. The harvester howled as the fire spread through the underground fungal network it had built. All around me, trees were falling, mushrooms were withering, and the faces in the bark were fading away. But as the thing burned, something happened to me. Maybe it was the spores I'd breathed in, or maybe it was the ancient fire, but I could feel myself changing. My skin felt like bark, and when I looked at my hands, I saw little mushrooms growing between my fingers. The harvester wasn't dying. It was scattering, spreading its spores far and wide, and part of it was now in me. That was 44 years ago. I survived, but I've never been the same. The Forest Service marked the whole area as an environmental hazard zone and closed it off. They didn't believe my story, of course. They blamed toxic gases from the volcanic vents for everything that happened. But I know the truth. I live with it every day. You see, the harvester left its mark on me. I can't live in regular houses anymore. Being under artificial roofs makes me feel like I'm suffocating. I have to sleep outside, where my skin can feel the moonlight. During full moons, the strangest thing happens. I look younger instead of older. The doctors can't explain it. I can hear trees now. Not like in a fairy tale. It's more like feeling their pain when they're sick, or their joy when it rains. Sometimes, when I touch a tree trunk, I see flashes of faces inside. Dr. Winters, Maria, Kevin, and all the others. They're still in there, somewhere, part of the forest now. Little mushrooms grow on my skin when I'm stressed, and I have to stay in the sun for at least a few hours every day, or I get terribly sick. But the worst part? I know it's not over. Every spring, I find new types of mushrooms growing in patterns they shouldn't. Trees in nearby forests sometimes bend in strange ways, all pointing toward Devil's Peak. And on quiet nights, I still hear those whispers in my head, calling me to join them. The harvester isn't gone. It's just waiting again, spreading its roots slowly underground, getting ready for another try. Sometimes I find hikers' backpacks arranged in perfect circles with dead grass around them. When that happens, I mark the areas and call in anonymous tips to keep people away. I'm telling this story now because I'm getting old. Well, sort of old. It's hard to tell with the way the full moon affects me, but someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to be ready. Because the harvester is patient. It's been here for millions of years, and it can wait millions more. And next time it rises, it'll be stronger. It learns from every attempt, you see. It learns, and it grows, and it waits. So, if you're ever hiking in the mountains of Washington State, and you see mushrooms glowing in the dark, or trees that don't look quite right, or faces in the bark that seem to follow you, run. Run as fast as you can. And whatever you do, don't breathe in the spores. Because the forest is changing, and it wants us to change with it. And somewhere out there, in the depths of the wilderness, the harvester is still harvesting, one soul at a time. My name is Nathan Redding, but everyone calls me Nate. This happened to me back in 1989 when I was working as a ranger at Red Rock Canyon in Nevada. I still remember every detail like it was yesterday, though sometimes I wish I could forget. Before becoming a ranger, I was a detective with the Nevada State Police. Growing up on the Paiute Reservation taught me everything about tracking and surviving in the desert. Life was good. I had a lovely wife named Sarah, and we lived in a cozy cabin near the canyon. But 3 years ago, Sarah disappeared without a trace in these very canyons. That changed everything. That summer was the hottest I'd ever seen. The thermometer kept climbing past 115°F, and the canyon walls seemed to shimmer like they were alive. I spent most of my time working nights, partly because it was cooler, but mostly because I never really slept well after Sarah vanished. The locals knew me as the guy who could find missing people, but nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. It all started when 7 tourists disappeared within just 2 weeks. At first, I thought it was just people getting lost in the heat. It happens sometimes. But then strange things began occurring. New petroglyphs, those ancient rock drawings, started appearing overnight. Rock formations that had been in the same place for hundreds of years somehow moved. And the weirdest part? We found spots in the desert that were ice cold, even in the middle of that terrible heat wave. I didn't know it then, but those first few days were just the beginning of something much darker, something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about reality, something that would change me forever. If I had known what was waiting for us in those canyons, would I have still gone looking? Honestly, I think I would have. Because sometimes, the truth is worth any price, even if that truth turns out to be your worst nightmare. It started with the footprints. I was following a normal trail one morning when I noticed something odd, fresh footprints appearing out of nowhere in the middle of solid rock. They just started right there, as if someone had dropped from the sky. But that was impossible. I called in Deputy Jack Morris, my friend from the local police, to help investigate. Jack was a no-nonsense kind of guy who'd been a cop for 15 years. Even he couldn't explain what we were seeing. "Nate," he said, scratching his head, "I've never seen anything like this." That same day, we found the first real clue that something was terribly wrong. A tourist's camera, completely melted like it had been in a furnace, but the ground around it was cool. Next to it was a perfectly arranged circle of personal items, watches, wallets, and jewelry, all belonging to the missing people. The local wildlife seemed to know something was wrong too. The desert is usually full of life. Coyotes, rabbits, snakes, but they were all gone. The canyon was silent in a way that made your skin crawl. We brought in Dr. Helen Reeves, an archaeologist who knew everything about the canyon's history. She was studying the new petroglyphs that kept appearing. "These symbols," she told us, her voice shaking, "they're not ancient. They're being made right now, but they're in a language that died thousands of years ago." Samuel Eagle Spirit, an elder from my reservation, came to help too. When he saw the petroglyphs, his face went pale. He pulled me aside and whispered, "The old stories. They're true. The skinwalker has returned." I didn't want to believe in the old legends, but then we found the blood trails. They would start suddenly, led for about 50 feet, and then just stop, like whatever was bleeding had simply vanished into thin air. Our watches stopped working right too. Mine would show midnight while Jack's showed noon, even though the sun was setting. That's when I started seeing things in the corner of my eye, shapes that moved too fast to be human, shadows that didn't match anything casting them. And sometimes, just sometimes, I thought I heard Sarah's voice calling my name from deep in the canyon. "We're dealing with something that doesn't follow the rules of our world," Samuel told us one evening, "and it's getting stronger." None of us knew then that we were about to face something that would change our lives forever. Something that was watching us, learning about us, and getting ready to show itself in the most terrifying way possible. The first time we actually saw it, none of us were ready. We were checking out a new cave we'd found when Jack's flashlight caught something moving. At first, it looked like a coyote, but then it stood up. It changed right in front of us, turning into something that looked human, but wasn't quite right. "Run!" Samuel shouted. But before we could move, it changed again. This time, it looked exactly like Sarah, my missing wife. "Nate," it said in her voice. My heart nearly stopped. "Come home." I knew it wasn't really her, but hearing that voice after 3 years, Dr. Reeves grabbed my arm and pulled me back, just as the thing that looked like Sarah moved. It crossed 30 feet in less than a second, like someone had hit fast forward on a video. That's when things got really bad. Jack tried to take a photo, but his camera burst into flames. The creature split into 3 copies of itself, all looking like Sarah, but with eyes that glowed like rainbow-colored flashlights. Dr. Reeves started acting strange after that. Her eyes got glassy, and she kept drawing the same symbols over and over in the dirt. "It's in my head," she kept saying. "It wants in." The next day, we lost Jack. We found his. I still have trouble talking about it. His skin was laid out on a rock, arranged like one of those ancient petroglyphs. Samuel said the skinwalker had taken his form to use as its own. Dr. Reeves got worse. Whatever was out there had gotten into her mind somehow. She started speaking in a language none of us knew, even Samuel. One night, she tried to drag me out of our camp, saying, "It needs you, Nate. It needs your memories." We had to tie her up to stop her from hurting herself or us. Samuel knew more than he was telling us. I could see it in his eyes. One evening, he finally opened up. "This thing," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "it's not just a shapeshifter. It's ancient. It lives between worlds and it's trying to open a door. Your wife, I think she found that door 3 years ago." The temperature dropped suddenly, even though it was middle of summer. Dr. Reeves started screaming, and in the distance we heard something that sounded like laughter, but not human laughter. We were running out of time, and we all knew it. The skinwalker wasn't just hunting us anymore. It was playing with us, and soon it would be ready for whatever it had planned. Samuel knew what we had to do. He led us to an ancient chamber deep in the canyon, a place where the walls were covered with crystals that seemed to glow in the dark. "This is where the worlds are closest," he said. "This is where we must face it." What happened next still haunts my dreams. Dr. Reeves suddenly went rigid. When she spoke, it wasn't her voice anymore. Finally, the thing inside her said, "You're here." The air got thick, like trying to breathe underwater. The ground under our feet started moving like waves in the ocean. Above us, the stars visible through the canyon opening began to spin and dance. Samuel started chanting something in our ancient language. He pulled out a small pouch of sacred herbs and threw them into our campfire. The flames turned bright blue. "Nate," he said urgently, "your wife found this place. The skinwalker didn't take her. She discovered its secret. That's why it wants you. You share her blood." Before I could ask what he meant, it appeared. Not just one shape, but many, shifting between a coyote, an eagle, Jack, Sarah. and things I can't even describe. The crystal walls pulsed with light, and I could see other places through them, like windows into different worlds. Dr. Reeves broke free from our ropes and ran toward the creature. "Helen, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. The thing touched her, and she just disappeared, like smoke in the wind. Samuel grabbed my arm. "Your wife left you a message, Nate. Look at the walls." And there it was. Among the ancient petroglyphs, I saw Sarah's handwriting. She had carved instructions, telling us how to trap the skinwalker, but the cost would be high. "I'll hold it here," Samuel said, pulling out an ancient tribal necklace. "You have to complete the ritual. It's the only way." The skinwalker screamed, a sound that made my bones feel like they were made of ice. It lunged at us, wearing Sarah's face, reaching out with hands that kept changing into claws and back again. Samuel threw his necklace around the skinwalker's neck, while I started reading Sarah's instructions carved on the wall. The creature thrashed and changed shapes faster than I could blink. First a wolf, then Jack, then my wife, then things I'd never seen before. "Complete the circle," Samuel shouted. I grabbed the ancient stones he had placed earlier and made a circle around the creature. Each stone lit up with a blue light when I set it down. Then I saw her, Sarah, the real Sarah, like a ghost made of starlight. She stood in one of those crystal windows reaching out to me. "Nate," she whispered, "finish it, please." Samuel was getting weaker. I can't hold it much longer. Blood was running from his nose and ears. The skinwalker was fighting back, making the very air ripple like heat waves on hot pavement. I started the final part of Sarah's ritual, reading the words she had carved. The ground shook. The crystals in the walls pulsed brighter and brighter. Samuel collapsed, but he kept his grip on the necklace. The skinwalker let out a horrible scream, not like any animal or human I'd ever heard. It tried one last trick, splitting itself into dozens of copies of Sarah, all begging me to stop. But I could see the real Sarah in that crystal window, nodding at me to continue. Everything happened at once. The crystal walls exploded with light. Samuel whispered something and vanished completely, just gone, like he'd never been there. The skinwalker's copies all rushed toward me, but when they hit the circle of glowing stones, they melted away like ice in the sun. The real skinwalker shrunk down, trapped in the circle, its true form finally revealed. Something ancient and terrible, like a piece of living darkness. The ground cracked open beneath it, and it was pulled down, screaming all the way. Then silence, complete silence. Sarah's ghost-like form smiled at me one last time before fading away. The crystal windows went dark. I was alone in the chamber. But something had changed. I could feel it in my bones, in my blood. I looked at my reflection in a broken crystal. My hair had gone completely white. And when I looked at the walls, I could still see things. Other places, other times, like faint photographs overlapping each other. The chamber became a government site after that. They found most of the missing people wandering in the desert, but they couldn't remember anything. Samuel's body was never found. The strange lights still appear in the canyon sometimes, and I know the skinwalker is still down there, trapped but not gone. As for me, I haven't slept since that night. I age only when the sun goes down, and sometimes I catch myself speaking in languages I never learned. Every year, I have to go back to that chamber on the same night. It's part of the price I paid. But at least now I know what happened to Sarah. She didn't just disappear. She sacrificed herself to protect others from what she found. And in the end, she helped us finish what she started. The canyon holds many secrets. If you ever visit Red Rock and see lights dancing in the distance, or hear whispers in ancient languages, just turn around and walk away. Some doors are better left closed. My name is Elizabeth Morgan, but everyone calls me Beth. What I'm about to tell you happened to me back in November 1995, and even today, I sometimes wake up in cold sweat thinking about it. I was 36 then, working as a forest ranger in Black Pine Valley, deep in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. Before that, I'd served as an Army Special Forces medic, but that's another story. I guess I should mention why I chose this remote posting. When I was just a kid, my dad was killed in what officials called a bear attack in these very woods. But I never believed that story. The way they found him, well, let's just say no bear I know feeds like that. That's partly why I got interested in cryptozoology, the study of creatures that most people think don't exist. I also picked up traditional herbalism along the way, learning about healing plants from the local tribes. For years, I'd been keeping notes about weird things I'd seen in these woods, strange footprints, animals behaving oddly, that sort of thing. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened during that unusually warm November. It started with just a few odd reports. As a ranger, I was used to dealing with lost hikers or animal problems, but this was different. And looking back now, I wish I'd run away when I saw the first sign. Maybe then, I wouldn't be sitting here today, fighting this constant hunger inside me, always wondering when it might take over. But I should start at the beginning. It was the 3rd of November, and the weather was strangely warm for that time of year. The kind of warmth that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up because you know it just isn't right. That's when we found the first mutilated deer. The deer we found that morning wasn't like any animal attack I'd seen before, and trust me, I'd seen plenty. It wasn't torn up like a bear would do it, or scattered like wolves would leave it. No, this deer looked like it had been. Arranged. Its bones were laid out in a pattern, almost like someone had carefully placed them that way. The strangest part? The meat wasn't rotted. It looked fresh, like whatever did this had just happened. I called my friend Paul Davidson, our local wildlife expert, to take a look. He'd been tracking animals in these woods for over 20 years, but even he seemed puzzled. "Beth," he said, scratching his gray beard, "I've never seen anything like this." That same day, 3 local families reported having the same nightmare, about something tall and skinny watching them from their windows. Now, I'm not usually one to connect dots that aren't there, but after what happened to my dad, I pay attention to patterns. The next 2 days got weirder. We found deep claw marks on trees, way too high up for any normal bear, about 15 feet off the ground. And the footprints, God, the footprints. They started looking human, then gradually changed into something else, like watching someone's feet transform right there in the dirt. But what really got to me was the cave. There's an old system of mining tunnels in Black Pine Valley, and while checking them out, I found fresh cave paintings. Not ancient ones, these were still wet. They showed dark, stretched-out figures surrounding a group of people. The paint was red, and, well, let's just say it didn't smell like paint should. That's when the calls about missing hunters started coming in. I remember sitting in my ranger station that night, looking at my notes and feeling my hands shake. The temperature outside had dropped suddenly, and a thick fog had rolled in, even though the weather report predicted clear skies. My radio crackled with static more than usual, and my compass kept spinning in circles. I knew right then that whatever was happening in Black Pine Valley was beyond anything in my ranger training manual. But I had no idea that this was just the beginning, and that in just a few days, everything I thought I knew about reality would be turned upside down. The next morning, we found the missing hunters' camp. It still gives me chills thinking about it. Their tents were perfectly fine, no tears, no signs of struggle. But their half-eaten breakfast was still warm on the table, steam rising from cups of coffee. It was like they had just vanished in the middle of eating. That's when Michelle Torres from Forest Service showed up. She was tough and smart, and I was glad to have her help. While we were looking around the camp, she found a video camera. Our hands were shaking as we played it back. The video started normal enough, just the hunters talking and laughing around their campfire the night before. But then, the camera started shaking. You could hear them whispering, "What's that?" The fire in the video suddenly went dim, and there was this sound, like someone breathing, but wrong, really wrong. The last few seconds showed something tall moving between the trees, but it was too dark to see clearly. Then screaming, and the video cut off. We followed some tracks leading away from the camp. There was blood, drops of it going up the trees like whatever took them could climb, and on some trees we found weird symbols carved into the bark. They looked fresh, and some were still oozing sap. That's when Paul started acting strange. He kept rubbing his arm where he'd scratched himself on a branch earlier. He said he felt hot, even though the air was getting colder by the minute. His eyes looked different too, wider, hungrier somehow. We needed help, serious help. I called David Running Wolf, an old friend, whose family had lived in these valleys for generations. He was a tribal elder who knew all the old stories. When I described what we'd found, he got really quiet. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. They're awake again. The Wendigos are hunting. I'd heard stories about Wendigos before. Every ranger in these parts had. They were supposed to be evil spirits that possessed people and made them hungry for human flesh. But those were just stories, right? At least that's what I kept telling myself. But then we heard it, a sound that didn't belong in our world, like a scream and a howl mixed together, coming from somewhere in the dark forest. Paul grabbed his chest and doubled over in pain. Michelle's face went white, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the day my dad died. Pure, absolute terror. The sun was setting, and we all knew that whatever was out there in the woods was getting ready to hunt. We took shelter in my ranger station as night fell. Paul was getting worse, his skin felt hot, and he kept saying he was so hungry, hungrier than he'd ever been in his life. Michelle tried to give him some food, but he pushed it away, mumbling that it wasn't what he needed. David Running Wolf sat by the radio, burning some herbs that filled the room with sweet smoke. He said it would help keep them away. He told us what we were dealing with wasn't just one Wendigo, but many. They were working together, hunting as a group, something he'd never heard of before. The bite or scratch of a Wendigo spreads the curse, David explained, looking at Paul's arm. The scratch that was there this morning had turned black, with strange dark lines spreading from it like roots. And once it starts, it's hard to stop. Suddenly, Paul let out a horrible scream. His back arched and his fingers, they started getting longer right in front of our eyes. Michelle ran to help him, but I pulled her back. Deep down, I knew we couldn't help Paul anymore. His eyes had turned completely white, and his mouth. God, his mouth was filling with sharp teeth. "Run!" David yelled, throwing his burning herbs at Paul. We rushed outside into the dark, but that was exactly what they wanted. They were waiting for us. In the moonlight, I saw them, tall, skeletal things that looked half human, half deer, with antlers and long, twisted limbs. They moved so fast, like shadows in the wind. Michelle screamed as one of them grabbed her. I reached for my gun, but David stopped me. "Bullets won't help," he said. "We need to get to the sacred cave. It's our only chance." I heard Michelle scream again, but when I turned around, she was gone. Just gone. The sound of her voice echoed through the trees, getting farther and farther away. We ran through the forest, the creatures following us. I could hear them moving through the trees above us, their long limbs crackling like breaking branches. The worst part was hearing Paul's voice among them now, calling our names, trying to make us stop. David was leading us to an ancient cave system, saying something about a ritual that could stop this. But with each step, I felt weaker, like something was pulling at my mind. I started having flashes, visions of running through the woods on all fours, of hunting, of feeding. The cave entrance was just ahead of us, glowing with a strange blue light. But as we got closer, I realized we weren't alone. Something was waiting for us there, something much bigger than the other creatures, and it was hungry. The thing at the cave entrance was huge, taller than any tree I'd ever seen. It looked ancient, with antlers that twisted like an old crown, and skin that seemed to be made of shadows. This was the leader, the first Wendigo, and it knew we were coming. David pushed me behind him and started chanting in his native language. The air got so cold that our breath turned to ice. The big Wendigo screamed, a sound that made my ears hurt and my head spin. All around us, the other creatures, including what used to be Paul, formed a circle. "Beth," David whispered, never taking his eyes off the monster, "I need you to listen carefully. In my bag, there's a small wooden box with sacred herbs and an old flint lighter. When I tell you, you must light them and throw them at the big one's feet. Do you understand?" I nodded, my hands shaking as I reached for his bag. But before I could get to it, the thing that used to be Paul jumped down between us. His face was stretched out now, like melted wax, and his fingers had grown into long claws. "Join us, Beth," he said in a voice that wasn't his anymore. "The hunger, it's beautiful." That's when everything happened at once. David threw himself at Paul, shouting at me to run for the cave. The big Wendigo moved faster than anything that size should be able to, reaching for me with its long, bony arms. I rolled under it, grabbing David's bag as I went. Inside the cave, the walls were covered in ancient paintings that seemed to move in the dim light. I could hear fighting outside. David was still chanting, louder now, and the creatures were shrieking in pain. My hands found the box in David's bag, and I quickly opened it. But when I looked up, the big Wendigo was right there, blocking the cave entrance. Behind it, I could see David on his knees, still chanting even as dark lines spread across his skin. He was starting to transform too. "Now, Beth," he screamed, his voice already changing. "Light it now." My fingers fumbled with the flint lighter as the huge creature reached for me. The herbs in the box smelled sweet and ancient, like earth after rain. The Wendigo was so close now, I could feel its cold breath. Finally, the lighter sparked. I threw the burning herbs at the Wendigo's feet just as David shouted the last words of his chant. There was a flash of blue fire that lit up the whole cave. The big Wendigo screamed, but this time it sounded scared. The cave walls started glowing with the same blue light. The ancient paintings came alive, showing warriors and spirits rising from the rock itself. David collapsed to the ground, his body shaking. His last words to me were, "Finish it, Beth. The fire must touch them all." I grabbed the burning herbs and ran through the cave, touching the blue flames to every painting I could reach. Each time I did, more spirit warriors appeared. They flew at the Wendigos like burning arrows, making them shriek and back away from the cave. But the big one wasn't giving up. It charged at me, its claws just inches from my face. That's when I felt something strange, like a warm energy flowing through my body. Without thinking, I pressed my hand against the largest painting in the cave, the one showing a great battle. The blue fire exploded outward, filling the whole cave with light. The spirit warriors swarmed around the Wendigos, forcing them into a circle. The big one fought back, but it couldn't escape. I watched as the blue fire wrapped around them like chains, pulling them toward what looked like a hole in the air, a doorway to somewhere else. One by one, the Wendigos were dragged through this doorway, including what used to be Paul. The big one was last, and as it was pulled in, it looked right at me and spoke in a voice that sounded like cracking ice. "We'll be waiting for you, Beth Morgan. The hunger never ends." Then everything went quiet. The blue fire faded, and the spirit warriors disappeared back into the cave walls. I ran to David, but he was gone. His body looked peaceful, like he was sleeping. But I knew his spirit had gone with the warriors to keep guarding whatever doorway they'd sealed the Wendigos behind. But something felt wrong. My skin was burning where the blue fire had touched me, and I felt a strange emptiness in my stomach, a hunger that normal food wouldn't fix. That was 30 years ago, but the story isn't really over. The government people came, of course. They cleaned everything up, made up some story about a forest fire and animal attacks. They tried to make everyone forget, but I can't forget. I won't. You see, that night left its mark on me. Every full moon, I feel it. That same burning in my skin, that same horrible hunger. David's tribe helps me through these times. They give me special herbs and perform rituals that keep the hunger under control. But it's always there, waiting. Sometimes I wake up at night and just know there are others out there like me, fighting the same hunger. I can feel them in my dreams. Not all the Wendigos were caught that night. Some escaped, and they're still out there, still hunting. And worse, they're making more of their kind. I still work as a ranger in Black Pine Valley. Someone needs to protect people, to watch for the signs. The caves are sealed now, marked as dangerous and off limits. But every now and then, when the moon is full and the night is cold, I hear those screams again, echoing through the valley. I keep David's wooden box with me always. The herbs inside help me stay human, help me fight the thing trying to grow inside me. But sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see something else looking back, something with hungry white eyes and too many teeth. To anyone reading this, if you're ever in the mountains and feel like something's watching you, if you hear strange screams in the night, or if you find fresh meat arranged in patterns, run. Run as fast as you can. And whatever you do, don't look back. Because we're always hungry, and we're always hunting. And if you ever meet a ranger named Beth Morgan, well, just pray it's on a day when the hunger isn't too strong.